Hey, what is going on, everyone? Welcome to another edition of the Waiver Wire Wednesday on Tuesday night. Going into week 10 of our fantasy football season here in 2024. I am Jeff D from Downfield Read. Thank you again for joining me for another Waiver Wire. No special guest this week. We have a couple of important things going on today. Number one, obviously, the trade deadline in the NFL today ended a few hours ago, so we can recap some of that trade information, I guess, last minute stuff. And then we've also got some kind of an election going on tonight as well. So I'm sure everybody is anxiously awaiting the polls closing in a lot of different states. Big thing tonight, obviously, in the United States. I hope you all went out and voted. I also have gone out and voted earlier today. So I have done my civic duty. But if you're not into that at all, this is why we're doing the show right now. Obviously, with Sean, I kind of mentioned him in an earlier show, Sean with Total Apex Sports and with Yard Barker, not joining me for this week. Not sure when he's going to be back to join me as my unofficial co-host. He's got basketball. He's a high school basketball coach as well on the side, outside of all of his great fantasy football writing. And then we had Susan from Gridiron Goddess, who joined us last week on our Fantasy Football Friday show. She will not be joining us either. She is very heavily into the election as well. So thought I would do this tonight, though, at this point in time. It is intentional to do it at this point in time in case you kind of wanted to give yourself a break from all of the political ads and political commercials and all that fun stuff, all of the bashing back and forth. And if you wanted to do that, well, you came to the right place. So we're not going to talk about politics tonight. We're going to talk about nothing but football. We're going to start off. I'm going to start off anyway with the bigger. I don't know. There weren't a whole lot of big trades, I would say. Nothing that really blew me away. Marshawn Lattimore was traded from the New Orleans Saints to the Washington Commanders, bolstering their defense for the remainder of the year. They've already got a pretty decent handle on their division with them in Philadelphia, kind of running away with that one. They should be able to really make him a great part of that defense there in Washington. Great addition there. The Steelers picked up Mike Williams from the Jets. They also picked up somebody else from the Green Bay Packers. Funny to see the Green Bay Packers getting rid of individuals, them being right in the midst of the NFC North. But the Steelers making two big moves. There were a few other smaller moves. My Baltimore Ravens made a move that was pretty insignificant, not the one that I think anybody was really expecting us to make for a cornerback that really hasn't done anything in the last 4 years. More of a depth piece, maybe an insurance policy. We do have quite a few corners that are either out or on the IR. But the one move that I think everybody expected them to make was for a pass rusher, some kind of interior defensive lineman, them having the worst pass rushing defense in the NFL. Their combined defensive linemen have a combined 6 sacks so far this year. But Eric DeCosta decided, you know what, we're not going to address that whole situation. We would rather just continue to put up 40-plus points per game and squeak out games and hopefully not, piss them away in the fourth quarter. So that's what my Ravens did. Kind of seems, a little bit off. You've got all this talent here, where you have to go out and grab somebody. I wouldn't even have minded somebody like a Calais Campbell. Zadarius Smith went from the Browns to the Lions. They made a pretty decent move there. I'm not sure I would have welcomed Zadarius Smith back after all of his smack talking. He used to be part of the Ravens organization and then decided to bash them after the fact. But not one move for an interior defensive lineman. Not one pass rusher was available out there. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But that's kind of the brief coverage that we are going to that's really all that we're going to cover for now as far as this NFL stuff or the NFL trade deadline. Not a lot of huge splashes out there. So let's get into the fantasy football stuff here real quick. And we will, or I will be taking your questions as we kind of go along here if you've got some. Otherwise, I usually answer those pretty quickly. If you follow me or if you don't follow me, you really should. Most of the time, if you've got questions, stuff like that, right down here, depending on where you're at here. Follow me on X, follow me on LinkedIn, follow me on, obviously, YouTube is where I do all of my posts now. You can go to my website, www.downfieldread.com. I don't do a whole lot of posts there anymore, unless it's kind of related to, doing a show or after the fact on a show. So you might as well just come here, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, all that fun stuff. But that's where we're at. So tell you what, let's get into some fantasy football stuff. And if you've got some questions along the way, go ahead and ask them. So if you haven't seen one of these shows before, Waiver Wire Wednesday, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some information on who you should be looking at or who you should be targeting this upcoming Waiver Wire Wednesday, overnight tonight when those go through. That's why it's technically Wednesday. We do the show on Tuesday, just in case there's any confusion there. I'm going to recap how my picks were for last week. A lot of people very happy with the selections and the information that I gave to them. Not too many busts out there on my end, so happy that I could help some people out. If you've got trade requests or trade questions, please look me up. Please go ahead and feel free to answer questions. So as usual, we are going to start off with the quarterbacks. And in week 9, last week Friday, my must-start quarterbacks were, number 1 was Jalen Hurts. He was 6th overall coming into the weekend as far as fantasy football points. And he finished top 2 or 3, depending on what kind of scoring format that you're in, finished somewhere around 27 to 29 points on the weekend. Top 3 guy. Obviously, you were going to start him. But I had him pegged as a top performer, and sure enough, he did not prove me wrong. Second one was a little bit lower down. Kirk Cousins, I thought he was going to have a better day versus Dallas. Coming into last weekend, he was 12th overall. Dallas, who allowed the second most points given up, 7th most total yards, 13th most passing yards. Kirk Cousins was able to put up a decent 16 to 18 points there, which put him right at 12th, low end quarterback number 1 for the week. And the one guy that I did brag about quite a bit that I thought was going to be a no-brainer to start here, it seems like the stars were aligned for him, was Bo Nix. Bo Nix came into the weekend as the number 9 ranked quarterback season to date before last weekend, going up against Baltimore, who gives up the most amount of passing yards, gives up a ton of points. He was only able to put up 14 to 17 points, which put him kind of right in that 15 to 17 range as far as quarterbacks go over the weekend. I thought he was going to be a lot better. If you watched the game at all, you pretty much saw Bo Nix get down into the red zone and then continue to miss throw after throw. He was overthrowing his wide receivers. He was underthrowing them once they got into the end zone. Probably should have had 3 touchdowns there. I think a better performance, better accuracy, like what we had seen out of Bo Nix from the previous weeks. He would have been in that upper echelon of quarterbacks for last week. So don't give up on Bo. Bad day for him, or I should say mediocre day. Like I said, he put up double-digit points, somewhere between 14 and 17. Not the stellar 20s and maybe even low 30s that you were hoping for, but that's what he was able to put up. My quarterback must sits. I tell you what, if you listen to me on this one, I nailed every single one of these. I said you got to sit Drake May. He was having a pretty good couple of weeks beforehand, 20-plus points 2 out of the last 3 weekends before this weekend. Going up against Tennessee. Tennessee's got a great defense this year. Doesn't matter what their record is. They're really stopping and holding offenses, even the better offenses, to very little points. He was only able to do, again, based on the format that you're in, 12 to 16 points overall, and that put him in that kind of 19 to 20 range as far as quarterbacks. I'm sure you had a better quarterback on your team, or even in the waivers that you could have and picked up for this game. So he was my number 1 sit for last week, and that one came true. Number 2 is Jameis Winston, put up 23.5 points the week beforehand against Baltimore. I warned about that, which is also what made Bo Nix look so favorable last weekend. But the only reason why Jameis Winston put up such great points is because Baltimore's defense dropped 3 interceptions, and I actually even said it in last Friday's show. The Chargers are probably going to get about 3 interceptions out of Jameis Winston this week because they don't drop them. And sure enough, they did. They got 3 interceptions from last week. So Jameis Winston had a terrible week based on what format you're playing in, 5 to 10 points overall. He was outside of the top 24 for quarterbacks, so not even a tier 2 quarterback for last weekend. And then number 3, I did say Tua. And Tua at Buffalo was actually played a little bit more surprising played a little bit better than what I thought he was going to end up playing. Still finished with 17.5 points. Not bad. That's a good performance, and it put him just outside of that top 12. Again, depending on what your format is, finished anywhere from 12th to 15th. So right outside of that top 12. So not necessarily a must sit depending on who else you had in there, but that also means that if you're in a 12-man league, there was probably a better option out there for you. My sleepers, guys that I thought, they're outside of the top 12. Maybe the stars are aligned for these individuals as well to come out and have a wake-up game. My first one was Sam Darnold. He was 15th in fantasy overall. He didn't really wake up a whole lot. Kind of finished with that same as Tua did. So I guess if you traded out Tua for Sam Darnold, you didn't really lose anything there. 15 to 19 points for Sam Darnold. Again, depending on the format, anywhere from 13th to 15th overall for quarterbacks last weekend. So didn't do quite as well as what I had hoped that he would have done. My second one, and this is a guy I'm never going to recommend. You won't hear me say his name for the rest of the season because he's got nothing but hard games coming up. The easy part of the schedule is over for the Chicago Bears and Caleb Williams. I thought I would throw him out there, give him a bone. I've been bashing him all year long, and I probably should have just kept bashing him because he put out a very bashable performance last week. Anywhere from 4 to 9 points, somewhere around 28th to 30th. Definitely not a QB1, absolutely not even a QB2 at that point in time. Can't seem to find DJ Moore. Can't seem to find many of his wide receivers. Kid's not ready to play yet. So I wouldn't recommend starting him really at all for the rest of the year. Look at his schedule. He's even droppable at this point. I wouldn't even probably keep him on your bench for any point unless you're in a dynasty league and you think he's going to bounce back next year after they fire Eberflus for basically saying that he wanted to go with Caleb Williams instead of Justin Fields. My third one actually did wake up. That was the Monday night game. Pat Mahomes came into the weekend at 21st overall in fantasy. Hadn't put up many points, but going up against the Denver Broncos, you saw that there was some leeway there that he was going to come back with something. He actually finished in the top 4 for quarterbacks, which I think is the first time. Yes, it is the first time that he's actually finished in the top 6 for quarterbacks at all in fantasy football this year. Anywhere from 20.5 to 24.5. First time that he got over 20 points this year as well. His top was 18 before. So Pat Mahomes had a good game for himself fantasy-wise, and the Chiefs come away with another win, not solely due to the fact that the officials were in favor of them, but if you can't see an offensive lineman moving when no offensive players are supposed to be moving, I don't know what to tell you. The right tackle, you know who we're talking about here. Right tackle started so early that he damn near tripped the guy running across the back half of the line, his own player there who was in motion. So I don't know how you don't see that. I'm not saying that they still wouldn't have scored a touchdown, but for Christ's sake, just can you throw the flag when they have a penalty? I mean, come on, NFL. It's getting kind of ridiculous. So let's get into the waivers. Your bye teams for this week. Bring this up now because then we're going to get into quarterbacks that you should look to add if you've got one of these quarterbacks on your team, or maybe your quarterback is hurt. They're not performing very well. The bye teams this week, Cleveland, really don't have much to worry about there as far as quarterback. I can't imagine anybody is starting Jameis Winston. Green Bay, you're losing Jordan Love. Las Vegas, not a real big deal there. They ended up benching Gardner Minshew for Desmond Ridder. I wouldn't play either one of those. I probably wouldn't even have either one of those guys on my team. But then there is Seattle as well. Geno Smith been playing admirably. He is not going to be available either, being on a bye. So you've got 4 teams on a bye this week. So here is the grouping of quarterbacks that I've got for guys that you should really be targeting this week. Make some room for somebody if your quarterback is on a bye. You've got number 1, Daniel Jones. And I know it sounds kind of ridiculous. He's owned in less than 15% of all fantasy football leagues. To date, he's 18th to 20th as far as season-to-date fantasy football quarterback. So it's not completely out there. Depending on your format, he is a tier 2 level quarterback. And if you needed somebody in a pinch, Daniel Jones is there. And oh, by the way, he actually finished 4th last week with anywhere from 22 to 24 points, playing Carolina this upcoming week before they go on a bye. He would be obviously an individual that you'd pick up just for the matchup there. I think he does relatively well there unless the Giants get out to a ginormous lead and they end up just running the ball the whole time with Tyrone Tracy. So But Daniel Jones, I don't think that that's going to happen. I think Carolina's defense is good enough to shut down the run a little bit in order to make Daniel Jones throw. So I would say he's going to be one quarterback that you're going to look out for, that you're going to want to pick up. A second one, and my couple of these guys might not be available. Aaron Rodgers is still out there. Aaron Rodgers for a quarterback. Ever since he got his guy Devontae Adams with the Jets, their offense has looked a little bit better. So Aaron Rodgers is owned in about 40 to 45% of fantasy leagues out there. He was 8th last week with over 20 points again. Going up against Arizona, which some teams have torched. He's going up against them this weekend, and they definitely have the ability to put up points as well if they're clicking like they did last week. They had multiple running backs get touchdowns. They had, who the weapons are in Arizona. But if they get rolling, the Jets are going to have to put up some points to respond. So Aaron Rodgers owned in about 40 to 45%. You got a coin toss there to see if he's going to be available. Another coin toss is Justin Herbert. He's owned in the same thing, about 40 to 45% of all leagues. He finished 11th last week with about 20 points as well. And it seems like here's my take on the Chargers offense right now. So obviously with Jim Harbaugh being there, he runs a run-first type of an offense, right? That's what he did in Michigan last year. That's what he's known for when he was coaching San Fran a few years back. It's why J.J. McCarthy wasn't focused on as much, even though they won the national championship in Michigan last year. He runs a run-first type of an offense. Well, they started that run-first offense with J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards. Well, Gus is out now. So you've got your sole guy there, Dobbins. He can't do everything. So they're having to kind of throw the ball a little bit more. They did just get Quentin Johnston back. So Justin Herbert has been able to open it up a little bit. It looks like he's not being really lagged down by any kind of injuries. So look for Justin Herbert here. He could have a good second half of the season. Again, 11th last week. If you're in a pinch, Justin Herbert will do just fine. Bo Nix again. I'm going to bring him up. He's actually 9th for quarterbacks season to date. He is a legitimate, bona fide, top-tier quarterback that should be started on every team. And for whatever reason, he's only owned in about a third of fantasy football leagues out there. He had 17-ish points last week. And like I said before, he missed at least 2 passing touchdowns that would have put him up there again. So if he's available, go after Bo Nix. And my 5th and final quarterback that I will tell you, if you're desperate, go for Cooper Rush. And again, if you're desperate. He's going to be the starting quarterback in Dallas this upcoming weekend versus Philadelphia, who has a very tough passing defense. The Cowboys might be without CeeDee Lamb even. So it is a very kind of a desperation move. If these guys are not available, if you're in a bigger league, Cooper Rush might be the guy to go with. Maybe he'll shock a few people. I don't see it happening, especially with their run offense just kind of starting to get off the ground. Not a lot of faith there in Cooper Rush, but again, if you're desperate, go for that one. Moving on to halfbacks here. So I've got halfback 1, halfback 2, hit on just about all my halfbacks from last weekend. Very happy with that whole scenario there. Gave people some great advice on their halfbacks. Number 1 I had was Alvin Kamara. He came into the weekend as the 2nd highest fantasy running back. He did the one question about him was if he was going to play or not. And even in our show on Friday, I said, if Alvin Kamara goes, you got to start him. If he's out and it's Jamal Williams, you got to start him. If they're both out and it's Kendre Miller, you got to start him. Because at Carolina, against that defense, you can really run up the score quite a bit. They allow the most points per game, the most rushing yards per game. So you've got that going for you. Alvin Kamara finished number 4 for running backs on the weekend, scored 24.5 points in a half PPR league is what we're talking about here. That's the most common. So he was a great start for you. Talked about Bijan Robinson. I said he was a must start. He finished at number 11 for running backs with about 18 points. And then my third one was Saquon Barkley, who if he's playing, you're going to start him. He finished number 1 overall, 31.4 points. And again, those are the guys that are like the no-brainers. When I talk about these guys, you're going to end up starting them, but they have the best chance to get the highest points for the week. So running back number 2, or your RB2 for your lineups. My first guy that I went with was Aaron Jones. And Aaron Jones had a little bit of a disappointing week. He still finishes as an RB2. He finished 23rd overall with just 10 points. Not sure what the problem was there against Indianapolis. They should have been able to run the ball a little bit more efficiently. Still ends up as a low and running back 2 for the week, finishing within that top 24. I said Chuba Hubbard would be a running back 2 as well. He actually finished 7th overall with 20 points for last weekend. So he had a hell of an outing as well. And then my third running back as an RB2 for last week was Brian Robinson Jr., who came into the fantasy season or the fantasy weekend as the 20th best fantasy football running back. Also looked for said that he was going to be looking for a bounce back week, and he finished 14th with 16 points for Eckler. Actually, instead of Brian Robinson in there, it was Eckler who was splitting carries with Chris Rodriguez Jr. So if you would have had Brian Robinson Jr. in there, as I said, he should have put up some pretty decent points against their opponents. He was not. Eckler took his spot and was 14th overall with 16 points. My must-sits for running backs for last weekend, I said you got to sit Bucky Irving against that Kansas City defense. And Bucky was coming off of a toe injury as well. It was questionable with a toe injury. He was 27th overall coming into the weekend, and he finished with only 5 points, which put him somewhere outside of the top 40. And then I said Javonte Williams, both Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin going up against Baltimore. They were not expected to do very well. I said to keep him on your bench, even though Williams had a good week the week before. Williams finished somewhere around 28th with 9.5 points. McLaughlin only had about 3.5 points. And then my third set, I should say, of must-sits was Nick Chubb and Jerome Ford, or any other running back that went up against the Los Angeles Chargers from last week, because they gave up the fewest points allowed, 10th fewest rushing yards, and Chubb finished with just 4 points, and Ford only had 1. So nailed my must-sit individuals as well. And then we've got our sleeper running backs, and obviously these are the guys that are noted as outside of the top 24. They're not your typical starting running back type caliber individuals. My first one, Kareem Hunt, who came into the weekend as 34th in fantasy, going up against Tampa Bay, who gives up the most total yards in fantasy football. Kareem Hunt not catching a lot of passes. We'll get into Samaje Perine afterwards, but Kareem Hunt did finish 10th overall. Not bad for a sleeper, finishing in the top 10. He had 18 points. So hopefully you started Kareem Hunt. And then I had Rico Dowdle, who finished just 1 spot ahead of him. Rico comes back. A lot of people not a fan of the Dallas running game since they started, or since I guess they kind of got away from, the whole Ezekiel Elliott experience and Delvin Cook. Who knows if he's going to play Deuce Vaughn. It looks like Rico Dowdle is the bona fide number 1 running back in Dallas right now. He finished 9th for running backs overall with 19 points. And the one individual that I did miss on for my sleepers, he stayed asleep. Actually, it wasn't even really his fault. Alexander Mattison in Las Vegas finished with only 3.5 points. And the problem was that Zamir White stole the only rushing touchdown that they had. And that was really the only thing that he did do, because he finished with, I think, 1 carry, 10 yards, and a touchdown. He finished with 7 points. So if Alexander Mattison would have finished there, it would have been a great week for him, but they decided to give it to Zamir White, stole those points away from Madison. Say Levy, what do you do? My my running back waivers for this week, a guy I just mentioned, Rico Dowdle. How about that? He, like I said, he is the clear running back number 1 in Dallas. He had 19 points last week, which was 9th overall. He's only owned in 68% of leagues. So you got about a 1 in 3 chance that he might be available. If he is available, go out and grab him, even with the Dak Prescott, or even more so with the Dak Prescott injury, with the CeeDee Lamb injury. There might be more time for Rico Dowdle out of that backfield. They might be relying very heavily on Rico. Then you've got Ray Davis. I'm going to put Ray Davis out there for waivers for this week. He is the running back number 2 in Buffalo, and he's put up 11 or more points in 3 of the last 4 weeks. So as the running back number 2, he's still getting you maybe some flex points in there if you wanted to throw him in as a flex, or if you're desperate on the running back situation. Last week was 16 points that he put up, and he's owned in only 21% of all leagues. So take a look at Ray Davis, see if that works out for you. Obviously, if you've got James Cook, you're going to want to pick up Ray Davis there as a handcuff, or maybe even trade for Ray Davis. Number 3 is Trey Benson in Arizona, owned in only about 15 to 20% of all leagues. At this point, he's probably just a handcuff to James Conner, but it was weird that him and James Conner and Amari DiMercato all kind of got playing time in there. Last week, Trey Benson had 8 carries for 37 yards with an average of about 4.6 yards per carry, and he had a touchdown. And he also had 1 reception for 18 yards. So if Conner goes down, again, another handcuff candidate here, if Conner goes down, he'll be the likely starting running back instead of Amari DiMercato. My 4th waiver running back that you should look at, mentioned it before, Samaje Perine in Kansas City. He's only owned in 5% of all leagues, and he only had 1 carry, but it's becoming quite clear that they're not going to throw the ball to Kareem Hunt. Samaje Perine is going to be the passing guy there. So he caught 4 or 5 passes, and one of them turned into a touchdown. So don't forego on Samaje Perine. He can get you some points, especially if you think it's going to be a little bit higher scoring game like it was against Tampa Bay last night. Samaje Perine, look out for him. Number 5, Khalil Herbert. And I only say this because earlier today, he was another individual that was traded to Cincinnati. It sounds like Zach Moss is going to be out for the remainder of the year. With Zach Moss out, I don't anticipate that they're going to give maybe more than 10 to 15% of the backfield snaps to another running back. But if you got Khalil Herbert to handcuff to Chase Brown now, that would be the way that you'd want to go, because if Chase Brown gets hurt, and he's had his injury problems earlier this season already, Khalil Herbert would be taken over, and he's a very viable running back to run in that Cincinnati Bengals offense. So handcuff him if you can. Again, only maybe 5 to 10% own Khalil Herbert at this point. And number 6 is, and this is if you can't wait and see what happens here, go and get Keaton Mitchell in Baltimore. He hasn't played yet. Not really sure. He's questionable to play again this week. It's an early week. It's a Thursday game against Cincinnati here. So I doubt that he'll play this week, but with 10 more days in between this week and their next game, I think they get Keaton Mitchell involved. And if you remember Keaton Mitchell from last year, he was super dynamic out of the backfield. If you thought Justice Hill was doing a great job as the number 2 back behind King Henry, man, is Keaton Mitchell going to blow that out of the water? So if you can stash him, if you've got some room back there, if nobody else is really available, maybe he's a last option. I think Keaton Mitchell is one that you should probably keep on your bench, especially if you've got a little bit deeper bench. So there's my 6 running back waivers that you should look at for week 10. Looking at the wide receivers from last week, going into week number 9, my wide receiver ones, I had Justin Jefferson listed as a wide receiver 1. He finished in the top 10 with 18 points. I had Jaden Reed, even with the crappy weather and the rain that was going on in Green Bay. I said Jaden Reed was one of my top wide receiver ones for the week. He still finished with 14 points. It was a top 20 finish. Didn't quite get what we expected him to. But again, I think the weather played a big factor in that. Even with the rain, again, finished with 14 points and in the top 20. And then my number 3 wide receiver was Drake London. And unfortunately, Drake London was taken out of the game early with a hip injury. Before that, he still managed to get almost 10 points and ended up as a top 35 wide receiver. Can't predict injuries here, guys. And I know that a couple people were kind of angry. Oh, I can't believe you told me to start Drake London. Well, yeah, I didn't think he was going to break his hip either. I'm not saying that he did break his hip, but you can never really predict when injuries are going to happen. There's a concussion, there's a broken hip, there's a tweaked ankle, there's a torn ACL. These things happen in football. So Drake London was on his way to having a really good game. Unfortunately, didn't get to finish it. Wide receiver number 2s, my first wide receiver number 2 was Devonta Smith, who actually finished in the top 12, had a top 12 performance with 16.5 points. Again, this is based on a half-point PPR type of a league. So Devonta Smith did very, very well. And then here's where it gets ugly again. And I mentioned, did not like Caleb Williams before. I really don't like him now because I did have DJ Moore ready for a bounce back week this week. And it sounds like that's going to have to wait. Maybe this week, maybe the next week, who the hell knows at this point. DJ Moore came into the weekend as the 24th overall best wide receiver in fantasy football, and he sure did disappoint. He only got about 5.5 more points. You might as well bench him if you've got other options until, Caleb is out of Chicago, really, because if you take a look at what's happened in Chicago, it's really kind of a travesty there. DJ Moore, one of the best wide receivers in the league last year, having Tyler Badgett and Justin Fields throwing the ball, they get somebody who's supposed to be better and more dynamic and a better passer, and DJ Moore's numbers have suffered. And it's not in the stead of anyone else. It's not like Keenan Allen is blowing up or Rome Odunze is blowing up. Nobody is. Nobody's doing anything in that offense anymore. So DJ Moore, I would keep him as maybe a number 3, number 4 option. Don't completely drop him yet, but he's kind of going in that direction. My third wide receiver, I said, was going to be a very good used wide receiver. Number 2 for last weekend was Josh Downs. 23rd overall in fantasy football for wide receivers coming into the weekend, had 20 points the week prior with Anthony Richardson, and Flacco came out and he just looked bored. He looked dull. He looked uninterested. Don't understand what the problem was going up against Minnesota. Didn't look very good. And Josh Downs finishes maybe top 35 with a disappointing 9-point performance. Hopefully you only kept him on in your flex. 9 points isn't bad for that, but definitely not what you expect from a starting wide receiver. My sit candidates, Amari Cooper, who actually didn't even play. He was questionable at that point in time. I didn't like him anyway in that kind of a situation. Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir, they were both coming back free of injuries going up against Miami. I figured that they were going to have to run the ball more. Miami came out a little bit better than usual, but Amari Cooper ended up not playing at all. I also said Jerry Jeudy versus the Los Angeles Chargers, who had given up the 9th fewest passing yards per game, 8th fewest total yards, fewest points allowed, and Jerry Jeudy fell right in line there. He finished somewhere around 30th, maybe outside of the top 30. Had 10.5 points, which put him right outside of that. And maybe my biggest goof of the week here, I told everybody to kind of hold off on the Baltimore wide receivers until we found out what Deontay Johnson was going to incorporate there. And it turns out he didn't incorporate anything. He didn't make any kind of a difference. He barely even played. So Zay Flowers was one of my sits, and he ended up as a top 5 wide receiver on the week. He only caught 5 passes, but he turned it into 127 yards and 2 touchdowns. They don't call him joystick for nothing. But continue to put him, I would say, in your starting lineup for wide receivers going forward. He will be a dynamic person to have going down the stretch here. With, again, Baltimore not picking up any kind of defensive help, they're going to have to score 40 points a game to even stay relevant. My sleepers for wide receivers for last weekend, and these all turned out really, really well. Cortland Sutton finished for Denver, finished while Bo Nix didn't have the best game of his career that I thought he was going to have. Cortland Sutton was definitely a target for him. Sutton finished as a top 10 wide receiver with 20 points last week, so hopefully you guys put him into your lineups. I also said DeAndre Hopkins, and look what he did. He finished 4th overall with 24.5 points. So starting DeAndre Hopkins in the future, probably going to be your best bet in Kansas City. And my third one was Xavier Legette in Carolina. He finished just outside the second tier of wide receivers. He was 25th overall with 12 points. And now I think he's only going to get more work as Carolina has traded Jonathan Mingo to the Dallas Cowboys. So you're looking at Legette, you're looking at Coker, and then keep your eye on Adam Thielen to see when he shows back up. I figured he was going to get traded today, and that's really the only reason why I was holding on to him in one of my leagues, is because I don't like him in Carolina. I don't like what they're doing there with Bryce Young. I don't think he can pass the ball around enough to get everybody enough points to satisfy them in a fantasy land anyway. So I'm probably going to end up dropping Adam Thielen because he did not get traded. I was hoping he'd maybe go to Houston. More points there. Maybe he'd go to Pittsburgh, and they went with Mike Williams instead. Maybe he'd go to Tampa Bay. There were a couple of different ones, and maybe even Washington. But he did not go anywhere, so it looks like he will be stuck and staying in Carolina with the Panthers. Sorry, Adam Thielen. My wide receivers that you should be targeting on your waivers for this week, I'm going to give you a bunch of 75%ers, and it's really only because they're owned in 75% of all fantasy football leagues. But these are the guys that you really should be targeting if they're still available. So I'm going to give you about a half a dozen of those because it's very unlikely that they're there. But if they are there, go out and snatch them right away. Number 1 is Darnell Mooney. I'm not sure how this guy is not unavailable in 95% of leagues. He's quite possibly one of the best wide receiver 2s that you can find on any team. And now that you've got the injury with Drake London, Mooney is even more valuable at this point. So go out and get Mooney. Ladd McConkey looks like the real deal. We kind of talked about how they're going to open up that offense with the Chargers. So Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnston, they're going to get more passes. Quentin Johnston had a great game as well, but he's only owned in about 75% of leagues. Some other guys, I talked about Cameron Sutton before. He had a big game. Khalil Shakir, how long is Amari Cooper going to be out for? So get him if you can. Josh Downs is still only available in 75% of leagues. He should be snatched up. Jacoby Myers, he's obviously on a bye this week, but if you've got room to stash him, if he's available, if somebody lets him go, he's still a wide receiver 1 on a fantasy football team that is not going to get ahead of anyone else. So they're always going to be playing from behind, which means they're always going to be passing. Somebody's always going to be needing to catch these passes. Jacoby Myers and Brock Bowers are probably the only 2 on that team that will. Outside of those 75%ers that we just went through, let's get on to some other ones. Number 1, Rashad Bateman. We talked about Zay before. Again, the Baltimore Ravens are going to have to go pass heavy, especially down the stretch here when they're playing Pittsburgh a couple of times, when they're playing Cincinnati a couple of times. So if they want to stay toward the top of that AFC North and make the playoffs, they're going to have to throw the ball quite a bit. Look for Rashad Bateman. Look for Zay Flowers. Rashad Bateman only owned in about 30 to 35% of all leagues. He's kind of a boomer bust kind of wide receiver right now. But looking at the Ravens schedule, they're going to need a lot of booms in their schedule coming up. So look for Rashad Bateman to kind of get a few more of those than what he's had in the first half of the season so far. Talked about Ladd McConkey, talked about Quentin Johnston. Now we're talking about Quentin Johnston again. He's only owned in about 15 to 20% of all leagues. Go out and snag this guy. Yes, he's been injured. If you're looking at it, he hasn't put up a whole lot of points, but he's played in 6 games this year. But he's put up double-digit points in 3 of those 6 games, and he's put up 20-plus points in 2 of those. So he is a very good wide receiver to go out and grab. Barring any kind of injuries, this guy is a guy that you could start pretty much every week. Cedric Tillman, he's not playing this week because the Browns have the bye, but go out and get this guy. The second-year man who was drafted 3rd round from Tennessee is making the most out of his opportunities this year. Is it Cedric Tillman? Is it Jameis Winston? Who's making this guy look good? It doesn't matter. He's owned in about 55 to 60% of all fantasy leagues. He has the bye this week. If you can afford to stash him, do it now. In the last 3 games, he's averaging about 18 to 19 points per game. You can't afford, and that's in a half a PPR league. You can't afford not to go and scoop this guy up. How about Nick Westbrook in Tennessee, right? Since D-Hop got traded, Mason Rudolph took over as quarterback. He's gotten back-to-back double-digit weeks with 11 and 13 and a half. If somebody else isn't going to get open in that offense, he's going to have to. So Nick Westbrook should be seeing a little bit more attention, a little bit more targets coming out of that offense. My number 6 one is if you're desperate. We talked about Mike Williams being traded from the Jets to the Steelers. Mike Williams, maybe go for him. He's owned in roughly 10% of all fantasy leagues. Pittsburgh has a favorable passing schedule over the next 2 months. So the remainder of the season here, they're playing Cincinnati, and we know how bad their pass defense is. They're playing Baltimore twice. We know how bad their pass defense is. The only thing that I will say is Mike Williams will be competing, quote unquote, competing with Van Jefferson. If this trade hadn't gone through, I know Van Jefferson was going to be one of my targets because Van Jefferson, number 2 guy in Pittsburgh, now maybe number 3, him and Mike Williams, very similar. You still got your main guy there. He's going to be getting the bulk of it. But seriously, maybe think about Mike Williams. Maybe think about Van Jefferson as well. So there's your wide receivers. When we get into the tight ends, here's my 3 must starts from last week. I said number 1, Travis Kelce. He was ranked 9th for tight ends overall coming into last weekend. He finished this weekend 3rd with 15 points overall. You knew that they were going to be passing a lot versus Tampa Bay. It might be a little bit higher scoring game, and it sure was. So Travis Kelce was one of my guys. Number 2, Kyle Pitts, who unfortunately he came into the weekend number 4 overall for tight ends and fantasy points season to date. He turned out to be a bust, even with Drake London getting hurt, he was not the guy that ended up getting all the passes from Kirk Cousins. He was a bust with about 1.5 to 2 points. Mooney had 5 receptions for 88 yards and a touchdown. Bijan Robinson had 7 receptions for 59 yards. McLeod had 3 receptions for 28 yards and a touchdown. Drake, before he got hurt, 2 receptions, 27 yards, touchdown. So 3 passing touchdowns there. Unfortunately, Pitts was not the recipient of any of those touchdowns. So Dallas did exactly what we thought Dallas was going to do. They were going to give up quite a few passing touchdowns. Figured that Kyle Pitts was going to be the recipient of one of those, and he was not, unfortunately. He was pretty quiet. My third must start, and the one that I boasted and bragged, and I couldn't believe that people were not going to start this individual, was Cade Otton. Cade Otton versus Kansas City, simply because it's hard to run against the Chiefs, and Otton's role had increased since Mike Evans and Chris Godwin were injured. So they continue to rely on Cade Otton, and Kansas City had one of the worst times, and still does have one of the worst times, covering tight ends. Well, guess what? Cade Otton finishes second to who? Mike Gesicki. There's another weird name. He finished number 1 on the week for tight ends. We'll get to him in a second. Cade Otton finished number 2. He had 17.5 points for you. Hopefully you started him on Monday night against Tampa Bay. My 3 must-sits all nailed as far as sits for last week. Zach Ertz, who came into the weekend 10th overall season to date for tight ends, had a forgettable 1-point performance against the Giants last week. My second one was Hunter Henry. Hunter Henry actually did pretty well. He came into the weekend 11th overall. He finished 13th out of the 12 tight ends, had 9 points, so not necessarily a sit, but pretty darn close, actually. I guess if you're only going to start one tight end, 12-person league, 13th is just outside of there. And then number 3 was Dalton Kincaid versus Miami. He finished outside of the top 20 with just 5 points, even with Cooper not playing. I don't know what if it's time to call it a day on Dalton Kincaid, give up on him altogether. 5 points for him, not very good. My sleepers, a couple of them woke up. Jonnu Smith, who came into the weekend 18th overall for tight ends, finishes 16th overall with 7 points. So if you were in need of a tight end, he performed a little bit for you. And then I also said Jake Ferguson versus Atlanta. I said, call me crazy. I think he's going to be a high-scoring game. He's going to get involved with it. He finishes 10th overall for tight ends on the weekend with 10.5 points. My last one did not wake up. Sam Laporta, not sure what's going on with his season. And I'm sure everybody who owns Sam Laporta is thinking the same thing. What a terrible draft pick, because I'm sure you drafted him high. Sam Laporta came into the weekend 15th overall on the season for tight ends, and he finished outside of the top 25 with just 4 points in that rainy game. But you would have figured short passes, rain, Laporta, beneficiary, not so much. So he did not. Your tight end waivers for this week, I've got 5 of them for you because there's some relatively good tight ends that are going to be out this weekend. You got David Njoku in Cleveland, out. Kraft, out. How about Brock Bowers, out. Seattle, Disley, okay. Probably not much of a factor on your team, but you've got 3 really decent tight ends who are all out this week. You're going to need some tight end help. My number 1 is Taysom Hill. He had 14 points last week, and he can play just about every position. So he doesn't necessarily have to line up at tight end. He might get in at quarterback. They could put him in the backfield. You just never know what's going to happen with Taysom Hill. So you put him in at tight end, and he puts in quarterback-type numbers. That would be awesome for you. So Taysom Hill is out there. Go get him. Number 2, Jonnu Smith. He was a guy that I picked up. I have Brock Bowers. I planned ahead. I got him last week already, Jonnu Smith. 18th overall for tight ends. He's owned in roughly 10% of leagues. Has a favorable matchup against the LA Rams, who have about as hard of a time covering tight ends as the Kansas City Chiefs do. That's going to happen on Monday Night Football. By the way, Taysom Hill owned in about 35 to 40% of your leagues. Jonnu Smith, about 10%. Number 3, Hunter Henry, which he could possibly be, which blows my mind. He's literally the 8th highest scoring tight end season to date, and he's only owned in 36% of all fantasy leagues. Come on, people. You gotta pick this guy up. He should be somewhere around 90%. Hunter Henry, go get him. He's got Drake May in there throwing him the ball now. He's getting a lot of passes. He's going to help out your team. Number 4, we talked about him before, Mike Gesicki, 24 points last week against Las Vegas. That actually bumps him all the way up to 12th overall on the fantasy season year to date, and he's owned in only 15% of all fantasy leagues. And then number 5 is Zach Ertz. I know he had a crappy week last week. He only had a 1-point week. He'll need to do more versus Pittsburgh this upcoming weekend. He's still 13th overall even after the abysmal week, and he's owned in under 40% of all leagues. So there's your tight end waivers. Go out and grab one of those guys, see who's available there. For a defense, and this is as far as we'll go, I don't really get into kickers. So we'll get into the defense. I said your must starts for last week. This one was kind of a hit or miss for me. I'm usually really good on these defenses. Buffalo, 6th best defense overall, playing against Miami. Didn't think that they were going to do much with Tua. I said that was a must start, and Buffalo got you just maybe 3 points on the day. My second one was the LA Chargers, though I nailed that one. They were a top 3 defense with 17 points versus Cleveland, who I said was going to come tumbling down after that game against Baltimore. And then number 3 was Kansas City versus Tampa Bay, because I mean, no Mike Evans, no Godwin, no McMillan. What are you going to do? They have the top tier rushing defense. What are you going to do against them? Against, spilling everything out to Kate Otten. But Kansas City got beat up pretty bad, pretty unheard of, unfamiliar for Kansas City. Chiefs gave up the 5th fewest points per game. They usually shut down the run, and they finished 24th overall in fantasy and just got 2 points last week. My sits were actually pretty on point. I said to sit Denver. Denver, coming into last weekend, was rated number 1 defense in fantasy and actually rated a top defense in NFL as a whole. They put up the worst points, actually negative points. You lost points with Denver if you stuck them in there. They were the best defense in there. So people are looking at that going, oh, there's Denver's defense. I dropped them 2 to 3 weeks ago, knowing that this was going to happen. If you look at the rest of their schedule, it's not very favorable. I think they got 2 decent games in there as far as matchups, but you're not going to want to play Denver as a number 1 defense right now. They put up the worst points. It was -3. They got shellacked. They got schooled. Number 2 is Green Bay. They were the 4th best defense, and they put up just 2 points, and they finished 24th overall. And then the New York Giants, who were the 11th best defense coming into the weekend. Big old goose egg, 2nd worst performance by a defense. Told you to sit all 3 of them. I hope you listened to that. My sleepers weren't very much better, though. I'll be honest with you. Not sure what happened here. The New Orleans Saints, they came crashing down against a really bad Carolina team. They were only able to put up, they were one of my 3 sleepers. They only put up 3 points. Didn't do much for you. And then I said Washington against the Giants. Washington's defense kind of finished in the middle of the pack there with only 4 points. But my other sleeper killed it. The LA Rams, who were 21st overall on the fantasy season for defenses versus Seattle, even though they didn't have DK Metcalf, Jackson Smith and Jigba went off. Top defense last weekend, 21 points. So if you listen to me on the Rams were not owned by that many people. You got to play the situations on these. And this is why when we get into waivers, this is who I like. I like the Los Angeles Chargers. They're owned by about 65% of all fantasy leagues. They are now a top 5 defense going into and playing Tennessee this week. Tennessee, who seems to be on the we really don't give a crap list about how the rest of the season goes. Pick up the Los Angeles Chargers. You might want to drop them right away after that. I mean, if you're looking for a 1-week filler, because the schedule gets tough after that with some high scores. But at least for this week, go ahead and get yourself some LA Chargers defense. Number 2, Chicago. They're owned by about 60% of all fantasy leagues right now. They're a top 8 defense with a good matchup this week against New England. But the same as above, the same as what I was talking about with the LA Chargers, you might want to just scrap them after this week. It's a 1 week and done. If you needed a defense to come in to play for you for 1 week and then you're dropping them afterwards, go ahead and do that. Number 3 is going to be the LA Rams. They're only owned by about 10 to 15% of all fantasy managers out there. I've been riding high on this defense the last few weeks, and they should be a good start for the next 4 weeks. Look at their schedule. Go out and grab them before they're gone. Their 10th overall season to date, and last week they were number 1. They're going to continue to give you points. The LA Rams defense, now that their offense is going to start clicking again too here with Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, that puts a lot more pressure on those other offenses that they're facing. Their defense has already held offenses to barely anything. The Rams are a great defense to pick up for the next month. Number 4, Arizona. Do yourself a favor. If you're not looking at the Arizona Cardinals right now, look at their schedule for the next 2 months. This will feed families, okay? If you plan on making a playoff run, you'll want to have this defense. They are owned in just 3% of all leagues. I own them in one of mine. I'm sticking with these guys. The next 2 months, they've got one of the easiest schedules on the back half here. Go out and get yourself the Arizona Cardinals. And my last one is the New York Giants. They're owned by 10% of all leagues. They have Carolina this week. Carolina just gave another piece away of their offense. We don't know if they're getting Adam Thielen back. I'm not sure who they have anymore besides Chuba Hubbard. Go out and grab the New York Giants defense. That will help you out for this week if you're looking for a one-and-done type of defense. So there's your waiver wires for Week 10. I wish you all the best of luck with that. If you've got questions, go ahead. Hit me up on X. That's generally where I'm answering most of my questions. But to find out dates and times of when we're doing the shows, usually, again, it's could be any time on Tuesday. Follow me on YouTube. That way you'll get it right away. Those are the big shows, Tuesdays and Fridays, and I'll usually try to throw something in there in between. Might do a mid-season power ranking just to see how it compares to my before the regular season started power ranking. See how off I was. I don't think I'm off by that much, but we'll see about that, and we'll do another show when the time comes. Otherwise, go ahead and follow below here, YouTube, Instagram, Spotify, LinkedIn, Facebook, all that fun stuff. We're coming up on about an hour here. I'm sure a lot of people are interested in the election results for tonight. If you've got questions, though, please go ahead and hit me up. I'm going to try to not pay too much attention to that and just wake up tomorrow morning and see if it's good news or bad news. All right. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Appreciate your time. And again, we'll see you soon. Thank you.